Hello and welcome to this edition of Inside Judicial Watch. I'm your host, Jerry Dunleavy. Today we're going to be discussing new Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, his confirmation, the confirmation process, the left's efforts to take him down, and what this fight means for the future of the court and the country. And joining me today to discuss all of this is Judicial Watch President Tom Fitton. So thank you very much for joining me today, Tom.
Thank you, Jerry.
So, Tom, let's kind of start at the end, and then maybe we'll go back to the beginning. So, last night there was a ceremony for new Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh at the White House, and you actually were there. So, why don't you tell our viewers kind of what it was like to be there at the end of the battle? He's a new Supreme Court Justice. What the mood in the room was like, what the ceremony was like.
Well, you know, Jerry, obviously it was an honor to be there, to be invited. I was there on behalf of Judicial Watch, and it was full of other conservative warriors who've been fighting for Judge Kavanaugh's confirmation to the Supreme Court. You had Senate leaders like Senate Majority Leader McConnell, who was instrumental in getting him approved. You had a bunch of legal heavyweights, federal judges, top-notch conservative lawyers, and then you had, incredibly, every Supreme Court Justice of the United States who came in to watch Justice Kavanaugh be confirmed to the Supreme Court. Wow. And I thought the president really did a great job in the sense that he began by apologizing to Justice Kavanaugh for what he had been through, for what both he and his family had been through. And he was right to do that. I'm sure there are probably those who didn't want to even talk about it anymore, but it needed to be confronted because judges, as the president said, Justice Kavanaugh is an innocent man, and he was maligned and smeared and abused by this Senate process. So it was a relief to see him finally on the Supreme Court. The effort to overthrow the Senate failed. But it's been damaged, and they damaged him, they damaged his reputation, they damaged his family, and in my view, there's got to be accountability for that, and we're going to be taking steps in that regard. Matter of fact, we already have in some respects, but it was a great victory, and given what went on over the last few weeks, pretty much everyone there has been exhausted in one way or another, those of us who've been fighting most directly. So it was good to finally be able to get together and celebrate this victory for the rule of law, the Constitution, and of course for Justice Kavanaugh, who, other men would have pulled out in facing these terrible allegations. And the president, again, deserves credit for standing by Judge Kavanaugh, because other presidents would have said, no, let's stop this and put another nominee forward. But he didn't do that. So it was a good team in that regard, the president and Judge Kavanaugh, and they had each other's backs. And I think the American people will be better off because now we have a great Supreme Court justice on the Supreme Court, much better than Justice Kennedy was, and so will help solidify a more conservative court for generations.
So let's kind of go back to then Judge Kavanaugh's nomination, what the nomination and confirmation process was initially like, because before these recent allegations, the process itself initially was already kind of spiraled out of control to a large extent. During his nomination or confirmation hearings originally back in September, I know that Judicial Watch has filed complaints that followed from that. So, it's kind of, I think, lost in some people's minds that even before these recent allegations, the Senate Democrats' efforts were already kind of heading in sort of an off the wall kind of direction. So could you walk our viewers through and kind of remind them what it was like even before these recent allegations took place?
Well, the original confirmation hearings were also awful in the sense that You had left-wing groups come in. They sent their protesters in, some of whom were paid, to disrupt the proceedings. And I was able to attend at least part of those hearings. And I can tell you, in these rooms, when someone stands up and starts yelling, it's disruptive. Everything comes to a halt. The police have to remove them, placing the protester in jeopardy, the police officer in jeopardy, and bystanders in jeopardy. And they're resisting arrest, and it was a violent protest in the end that was going on repeatedly in, of all places, ironically, a nomination hearing, confirmation hearing for the Supreme Court. And you had this affront to the rule of law. And then on top of it, you had the Democrats on the panel breaking the rules. You had Senator Cory Booker, for instance, make a show of putting documents on the record he wasn't supposed to, and saying he violated Senate rules, the violation of which would require his expulsion. Now, it turns out the rules he purported to violate, he actually didn't during the hearing, so he had to go back later and post materials online that were prohibited by Senate rules, thereby violating the rules. And it was rule breaking and disrespect for the rule of law, because those documents that he posted were only provided to the committee based on promises of confidentiality that wouldn't be breached, and that's why you're not supposed to release them. And so by Senator Booker, by releasing them, he broke the rules, he admitted he did it, and it's only Judicial Watch to say, well, if you break the rules, you got to have an enforcement action. So we filed an ethics complaint with the Senate Ethics Committee. We'll see what happens. But you know, in terms of after-action activities, you know, everyone's practiced calling their senators to support Judge Kavanaugh for the Supreme Court. Well, call that same number again, 224-3121, and ask the Senate Ethics Committee and ask your senators, are they going to support holding Senator Booker accountable? He broke the rules, and again, and if he's found liable for breaking the rules, he can be expelled from the Senate. And if we don't want this lawlessness to continue, the Senate's got to police itself.
Right. Quite famously referred to it as the closest to his Spartacus moment as he was ever going to get. Right?
Yeah, he ain't Spartacus, that's for sure.
But your point there that if there isn't accountability for tactics like this, tactics that break the rules, then things like this are going to continue to happen. And we actually, so after that sort of initial confirmation hearing, confirmation process, as things seem to be moving along towards confirmation, that's when this initial allegation from Dr. Christine Ford leaked out to the media, to the Senate. I mean, do we even fully know at the moment how the story sort of initially happened?
Yeah, I'd like to know how we're going to figure that out. You know, the Senate isn't subject to the Freedom of Information Act, so we can't subpoena or, ask under the Freedom of Information Act Senator Feinstein for her records about how she handled this allegation. The allegation came to them last July, at least the Senate Democrats. They sat on it for weeks and weeks, and there are one of two things you can draw from that. Either Feinstein looked at the allegation, found it wanting, and didn't act on it, or they sat on it purposely to blow up the confirmation process after the hearings took place. You know, it was interesting about that hearing that took place with Ford and the others. What I thought was news about it was we found out more about the corruption of Senator Feinstein's operation. They had this information when Judge Kavanaugh was interviewed by the committee, was interviewed by the FBI initially, and they sat on it. And then it turns out that they had, for instance, recommended the lawyer that was working for free for Dr. Ford. So all sorts of things need to be investigated about how Dr. Ford, who said she didn't want her name out there, had her name be put out there, and who's responsible for it. And if the Senate broke the rules again, like as was done by Senator Booker, many senators then broke those rules. You know, this is why you have an ethics process in theory. And are they going to hold each other to account? Now, they won't do it if they don't hear from voters. I can guarantee you that.
Yeah. So you're referencing there Feinstein receiving the letter, sitting on the letter, while at the same time recommending an attorney for her and all of these different things. And then the letter leaking out, all of that. So why don't you walk our viewers through sort of what we learned from the allegation, then what we learned at the actual hearing that ended up taking place. Because as people remember, Dr. Ford and then Judge Kavanaugh both came and actually testified in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee about this. What sort of emerged from that, do you think?
Well, it was an incredibly tense hearing, I can tell you that. It was emotional. Dr. Ford came across as sincere to most of us in the room. But what struck me about her testimony was there was nothing new there, in the sense of providing additional corroboration, additional evidence, or credible evidence that Brett Kavanaugh did what she said he did. And in fact, some of her testimony suggested that she had an alternative agenda and knew that her testimony didn't ring true. And so I ended up thinking, well, she made a sincere case and had there was a political issue for the confirmation as a result, at least after she finished testifying. But upon any reflection or consideration, her case has collapsed. And sure enough, Judge Kavanaugh came out, made a strong case in favor of himself, adamantly denied these allegations. And when you've got someone saying it didn't happen, and you have someone saying years after the fact it did with no corroboration, it's only fair to basically cast aside the charges in a way that doesn't prevent him from being confirmed. And in fact, that's what ended up happening. The FBI was brought in after the fact to interview some of the witnesses that supposedly might have known what happened. Nothing was corroborative of what she said. And of course, these two other claims, one about another sexual assault, another one alleging gang rape, just on their face weren't credible. So the problem here is you had this new way of thinking by the left, that we're going to take the Stalinist approach. We're going to make accusations, no evidence, and demand you disprove them. I mean, that's the Alice in Wonderland backwards approach to any sense of fair due process if the Senate's going to follow that process. And the fact that they got away with it and almost took out a nominee because of it ought to give us all pause. And on top of that, they had their leftist allies out in the hallways threatening senators in a violent way, assaulting them, intimidating, and just making a mockery of the institution of the Senate. And they wanted to overthrow the Senate in many ways. And thankfully it didn't work, but it was a close-run thing.
Yeah, and it was very close. Now, we've talked a little bit about what Senate Democrats did. If we could talk a little bit about the media's role in this, because you mentioned, Dr. Ford's story ended up coming out in the Washington Post, and then you mentioned the other stories, one in the New Yorker, and then one that I'm not even sure if it really even got published anywhere specifically. But what did you think about the way that the media handled the initial allegation, the subsequent allegations, and then sort of this dive into the yearbook and all of this sort of thing? What do you think about how the media handled
Well, there
all
were
of that?
propaganda outlets for their liberal allies who wanted to destroy Judge Kavanaugh. I mean, the left has decided that there are no rules apply here. Journalists, many left-wing journalists, threw any supposed rules they follow out the window. You had that terrible New Yorker piece. You had CNN almost running 24/7 these gang rape allegations. And typically you wouldn't run material like that without corroborating evidence. But all you needed to say was something bad about Judge Kavanaugh, and you got on the news. And that was really outrageous. And so the Senate took a blow. Our Republican institution of the Senate took a blow. I mean Republican with a small r. Mm-hmm. And journalism took a blow here too, because the veil has been lifted for those who those few Americans who are oblivious to it, that much of the mainstream media are partisan and leftist, and if they have an agenda to get you, all the rules go out the window. I'd like to. But one thing I'd like to see is Justice Kavanaugh sue the heck at everybody who defamed him. It's unlikely he'll do something like that as a Supreme Court justice, But that's why they do what they do, because they think they can get away with it. So our job at Judicial Watch is to use the tools available to us under the law to hold them accountable.
So following Dr. Ford and Judge Kavanaugh's testimony from the Senate Judiciary Committee, there were calls from a number of people, Senator Jeff Flake and others, for an FBI investigation, which ended up actually happening, to do an additional FBI background check. What were your thoughts on the wisdom of that, and then with the conclusions that they came to?
Well, in a sense, it resulted as what we suspected, that everyone knew. Let me start over. To the degree it resulted in the outcome that it did, well, of course, in retrospect, it looked okay. But everyone should have known that the FBI was going to find nothing, because most of the witnesses that they had to interview had said that nothing happened here. And those who alleged something happened either weren't credible or their stories didn't check out. So there really wasn't much for the FBI to do. It should have been done earlier, but it helped secure some additional votes and reassure some of the fence-sitting senators on the Republican side that they could vote for Judge Kavanaugh, and it resulted in his confirmation. But the FBI investigation wasn't needed. That hearing where Judge Kavanaugh was maligned by the left and the Democrats on the Senate side of the Judiciary Committee wasn't needed. So this was an abusive delay of the process. Thankfully, he was finally put on the court, but those 2 or 3 weeks were a disgrace.
Yeah. Now, you talked a little bit about the accountability that's needed in this situation to make sure that something like this doesn't happen again. Similar things have happened in the past. Some would say with Robert Bork, with Clarence Thomas, and so there is sort of a history of efforts like this taking place. Now, you mentioned that Judicial Watch is going to try and do what it can to make sure things like this don't happen. The ethics complaint against Cory Booker, what else is there that you think that Judicial Watch can do to hold the Senate accountable, to hold these people accountable, to make sure that the process doesn't continue to escalate and continue to spiral out of control like this?
Well, there may be other ethics complaints that we can file. The lawyers involved that committed misconduct, they could be subject to sanction by the bars. So we'll take a look at that. The bars are essentially the legal profession itself. And we can ask questions of the Justice Department and the FBI about how they handled the Kavanaugh nomination, in the sense of finding evidence showing that there were folks lying about Judge Kavanaugh, and that they have information like that. We'd be interested in finding that out. And there could be additional, as I said, ethics complaints against some of the senators who abused their offices to target Judge Kavanaugh. Look, Senator Feinstein was in the IRS or the Justice Department, and she went after Kavanaugh like she did, and had information and then released it in a way to destroy him, as opposed to advance the rule of law or regular government functions. There'd be no doubt what would happen to her. She'd be subject to investigation and a whole lot worse, potentially, in terms of prosecution. It's only because these folks are senators is it hard to enforce the rule of law against them. That's why over the long term it's important that we have the Freedom of Information Act apply to Congress. We get a more hardcore ethics process. Because right now, if you file a complaint with the Ethics Committee, it's split in half in the Senate, half Democrats, half Republicans, which is a recipe for doing nothing. So we got to really put pressure on the Senate to enforce their rules now, but come up with a better process to enforce them in the future too.
And when it comes to the way that the protests took place, and there were other sort of things that took place, someone actually ended up getting arrested and charged for doxing, which is releasing public information on U.S. senators in the midst of the confirmation process. So besides the actual physical protests that were taking place, there was doxing taking place. There were things like this, threats being made to various senators' offices, to various people's families. I mean, so we're looking at a situation here where not only was the process itself by the people in charge, the Senate Judiciary, Senate Democrats, handled poorly, but also by the protesters and by other people. So what do you think can be done in that regard?
Well, we have to call them out for what they did. These weren't protests. These were violent actions designed to overthrow our republic, in this case, the Senate. They don't want to follow the rules. They wanted to have mob rule. Thankfully, the Senate resisted it, but it was a close thing, as I said. And that can't be tolerated. You saw them attacking, literally, the building of the Supreme Court the other day, clawing at its doors, and being encouraged by other senators in the current Senate in this lawlessness. You have senators being confronted and assaulted and threatened with the most heinous and vile threats. And these are not individual threats, and you can't say anything, you can't say it was just a one-off threat. Look, you had organized intimidation activities targeted at the Senate. And if you want that to happen, that way lies ruin for our Republican form of government. And we've got to stand strong against it.
So as we move forward here, I mean, it's very possible that President Trump's going to get another Supreme Court pick. He might get 2 more. I mean, who knows? Obviously, the process needs to be reformed. We're doing work to try to hold people accountable. As we wrap up here, what sort of likelihood do you see of this process changing? Do you see this as fixable, or do you see that Senate Democrats and the left might continue to escalate and continue to go down this path?
On the one hand, it's very concerning that the left is designed as now trying to blow up the system. But it does show that they see themselves losing. I know sometimes conservatives think that things are a nightmare here. But the left doesn't want to play by the rules anymore because the rules aren't working for them anymore, because they perceive conservatives to be winning on policy and certainly on the key issue of the judiciary. So in many ways, it's a positive thing, if I can look at the silver lining. So we just have to keep on winning in terms of advocating for putting strict constructionists, lawyers, and judges who will apply the law rather than make it up as they go along. That's one way to protect the system over the long term. And of course, the Senate needs to stand fast against this. And I just hope some Democrats, put their thinking caps back on and become more reasonable here, rather than letting the mob run the show over there. Because this is over the long run will destroy both parties if they let this violence get out of control, as what happened during the Kavanaugh hearings.
Yeah. Well, Tom, I appreciate you coming on to fill us in. It's interesting to hear from someone who is at the initial confirmation hearings, at the subsequent ones with Dr. Ford and with Kavanaugh, and then was at the White House ceremony as well. So you were kind of there, not just fighting with Judicial Watch, but also there in person for a lot of it. So it was great to see. It was cool to see, and it's good to have your insights. So, and I encourage all of our followers to continue to follow what Judicial Watch is doing, what Tom is doing as he leads us, as he leads our organization in holding these people accountable and making sure that this doesn't happen again. So be sure to follow us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, follow us on Instagram, follow us on YouTube for the latest as we continue to hold the Senate accountable and see what we can do to fix the judicial process here. So until next time, I'm Jerry Dunleavy with Inside Judicial Watch, and thanks for joining us.